Good evening. From the Gail Lemron Auditorium on the campus of Embry-Riddle, welcome to the Embry-Riddle Speaker Series. I'm Mark Bernier, moderator for tonight's event. Our guest to close out our fall series served in Congress for 24 years. He was the chief of staff for a Florida senator, and he also served in the Florida legislature. He made his fortune in the private sector, but has been called upon by his colleagues for his wisdom in issues domestic and foreign. Tonight, the future of transportation, and it is so fitting to have that happen here at Embry-Riddle, where research and transportation in various fields is the cornerstone of what this university is all about. Ladies and gentlemen, please extend a warm welcome for our very good friend, a man who we have named a complex after the Micaplex. Ladies and gentlemen, Congressman John Mica. You know, I've known you for 25, 26 years. Luigi? Really?
That's my middle name, and very proud of it. My mother's has Italian heritage, and I was named John Luigi Mica, and I never knew a lot about my uncle. He died early. I knew him, but the night that we were in Congress all night debating and considering Medicare drug prescriptions, I looked on the internet and put my uncle's name in, the whole name, and up popped his picture in his World War II uniform, and it said, "A hero of the Normandy invasion." So proud of him and proud to be named after him, but I never knew, and he never spoke about his military service. So that's where the Luigi comes, and I'm very proud of it.
And I know you've been to Italy several times.
Every year since, almost since 1963, and visit some of the family there, and we've had some of them over visiting us, and the newer generation are very successful, very proud of them.
Your wife, Pat, who couldn't be with us tonight, also played a role in your career, working with you on campaigns, and then I think, wasn't she the head of the Wives of Members of Congress?
She was the president of the Republican Spouses Organization. In fact, tomorrow she'll be at a luncheon in Washington with current spouses of members of Congress. It was delayed some because of the funeral services for President Bush, but they're meeting and luncheoning tomorrow near the Capitol after the funeral service. She has been my right arm and companion. When I was in business and development, my first project was in Volusia County, on the ocean front of all places. In fact, yesterday I've been sorting through some of my material. I try to spend several days a week sorting through that. It's all going to the Winter Park Library, my papers, but I found in one of my business boxes, archive boxes, my first project in Volusia County, 100-foot oceanfront building, residence, on the ocean, again, 100 feet, and the price was down in the quarter, $89,000. Any takers?
Also, two children, Deanna, who is here with us tonight.
Yeah, she's joining us tonight.
And
Clark.
Yeah. Got to know both very different personalities, too.
Yeah, that's a combination of her mom and dad.
You've had such a long and distinguished career in public service. You served in the Florida legislature. Many people know of your brothers, one of which is a Democrat. What's it like at Thanksgiving? Yeah.
Well, interesting conversations. We are the only two brothers, Dan and I, to serve in Congress since 1889 from different political parties. After the Civil War, there were a number of divided families, but we get along very well. My other brother, Dave, the youngest one, is in Tallahassee, and Dave Jr. has been an appointee and worked with Governor Scott, now Senator Scott. So there's another generation of Mica behind it. I got to tell one quick story because I called Dan. We were reminiscing about President Bush on Sunday after his passing. And people have asked me about memories of him, and I go back to supporting him way back when he was running against Ronald Reagan. I was in the legislature and helped him here in Florida. But I was asking my brother Dan about Bush. Now, if you know the Mica brothers, we're a year and a week apart. We look very similar. I'm better looking, but we look very similar. So my brother Dan was saying, he says, I can't forget the last time I saw President Bush. He said, we came from a function in the U.S. Capitol building, and he says, I walked out with him, and he says, President Bush looked at me, at my brother, and said, are you or are you the other one? It's kind of cute because he knew both of us, but we when you don't see us for a while, we look alike.
We're hearing all the accolades on television. It's interesting that some of the people who are throwing out those accolades were people who couldn't wait for the president to leave office. But you knew him, and you knew his leadership and what he was to this country. What's the best memory you have of President Bush?
When, I've been redistricted a number of times. I've had Volusia up until this, when I lost the seat, and it was pushed out of Volusia into a little bit more hostile Orange County territory. But I got redistricted from Winter Park in Orlando all the way to Jacksonville. And I did not know many people in St. Johns County, Ponte Vedra, that area. And when you're running in a new area, you need some credibility, someone to support you. That area is sort of amorphous politically, but for me to have some presence there, I needed someone to come in and help me. And I tried, different folks, and the only one that responded to me was George Herbert Walker Bush, the former president. And he came and spent almost a day with me, and we had a very successful luncheon in Ponte Vedra. We had over 200 people there, which was pretty good. I didn't know 20 people there, but it helped us establish my credibility. And how can you not be grateful for someone like him who would come and help someone like me in a tough race?
24 years in Congress, yet you never ran for the Senate. You worked with Paula Hawkins. You got a taste of the Senate. Why not?
Well, I never intended to stay that long in the House, but I was able to move up the chain of command in the House. I knew what I wanted to do was get on the Transportation Committee, and I wasn't an attorney. I did projects. I love looking at something coming out of the ground in Volusia County and Orange County, wherever my projects were. So I picked transportation as a committee choice. I rose very quickly in the ranks. I became chairman of Aviation in February of 2001. How fateful that was. But Bud Schuster from Pennsylvania, who had been the chairman, had to leave. Don Young was coming in as the new chairman, the Bridge to Nowhere chairman. And Don ended up saying that he was going to be the chairman, and Bud Schuster could be the highway subcommittee chairman, but Don would control all of the staff. So Bud Schuster got elected in November. Here it is January, and Bud Schuster basically said, "The hell with that." He says, I'm not going to take the chairmanship of a subcommittee if I can't have my own staff, and he resigned from Congress. So that did a flip of the highway committee. Was one of the most sought after, highway and aviation, and the guy that was running for one chose highway, left aviation empty. Don Young liked me. I went to Alaska 3 times, never a quake while I was there, with the chairman to be. And I ran for the position and got it, and became chairman in February. Who would know that I would be chairman for 6 years, and during that time, the most difficult time for aviation in America, which I was pleased with what we were able to do, both in securing aviation and then going on and securing the industry. The industry was collapsing, and we set up a loan guarantee program where we put the taxpayer in the first place if something happened. We made very tough terms. Every one who took a loan paid it back. There were 2 reschedulings. We made $1/3 of $1 billion from what we charged them, and then we closed down the program. And the industry did well with tough love and tough terms. But that was success.
2001, that fateful day, you were on our schedule to speak, as we often did. And I think, were you in the Pentagon having a breakfast that day?
I was in the Pentagon with the Secretary of Defense. He had called over about 5 hawks, those that are pro-military, for a breakfast because Bush had just taken over. He had just become the Secretary of Defense, and they were going to present their first proposal to Congress that wanted support. And so I was invited over, and we finished the breakfast. We were at like a conference table right outside his office. Assistant Secretary, or Deputy Secretary, I think it was Wolfowitz at the time, was there. Secretary of the Army, the top assistant to the Secretary of Defense, who recently just passed away. But we all had breakfast, discussed our plans. After, it was about 8:50, we stood up and everyone was saying goodbye. And I stood there talking to the secretary, and my phone rang. I took it out and stepped away. And being the chairman of aviation, my staff director called me, Sharon Pinkerton, and said, "Are you near a TV?" And I said, "No." She says, "Well, a plane just went into the World Trade Center." Oh, I said, "Horrible." And I had read, becoming chairman in February, more of the history of aviation. And one of the stories I read was the reason the federal government got into air traffic control and created the FAA was that a plane flew into the Empire State Building. And that's how they started federal participation and control of aviation. So in my mind, I thought, a horrible accident. And then I continued my conversation, told the secretary, because he didn't even know at that point. And phone rang again. I took the phone, and Sharon said, a second plane went into the other tower. And I said, "Sharon," I said, "that's impossible." I said, "You must be watching a CNN rerun. It can't happen." And so I was just found it. About the same time, an aide came up to the secretary and informed him, and he went into his office. But in the meantime, the other members of Congress had already left. Now we're at 9 o'clock. And there was, again, a couple of friends who were his assistants that I was talking to. It's about 10 after the bus or the van taking us over had gone. So I wandered downstairs and out into the parking lot of the Pentagon and actually got a ride from someone I didn't know back to the Rayburn building where my office was. I got out of the van, or the car that took me over, and I looked up and I could see the smoke coming out of the Pentagon. And as I told you, maybe, or some of the folks earlier, we were talking about 9/11. 2 friends were in the Pentagon. One, Terry Lynch, who was an aide to Senator Shelby was killed in the Pentagon. And if you visit the memorial, the exhibit up there, the office, they have a plaque from his office that was retrieved from the debris, and a melted phone from his office there. And then Barbara Olson was a staffer for me on the Government Reform and Oversight Committee. And she was on the plane that hit the Pentagon. She was killed. And then the head of the New York Port Authority, a very good friend, Neil Levin, he was in the World Trade Center where I had conducted a hearing on aviation for New York in August with him. And he was in the top floor in the room where we left him in August. And he and everyone who helped me with the hearing were killed except for the airport director who was at a conference in Montreal. So it was a very difficult start to a tenure as a aviation chairman. We did have on the president's desk the Transportation Security Act by Thanksgiving as he requested. And one of my worst accomplishments was creating TSA. But I had a different idea for it, and that's a long story. It turned out as mostly all government project.
I seem to recall Pat.
That's worth another entire session.
Well, I think Pat was your senior advisor on TSA after she went through it once, and she had a time, didn't she?
Well, I'm sure everybody can tell their TSA stories, including the former chairman. But again, everyone wants us to be secure, and there are different ways to approach it. Mine was private screening under federal supervision, because on 9/11 it was the federal government that failed. It wasn't the private screening. They never set up the standards. They delayed instituting the training. The directions to the pilots, we've got the president of Embry-Riddle, President Butler here, but the instructions to the pilots in their manual was to cooperate with the hijackers, and when you got to Havana to contact, I guess it was the Swiss embassy there. But that was what the federal government had put in place and certainly failed.
I want to move through the different aspects of transportation with you. Let's talk aviation first and aerospace. What's likely to be coming in the future? Are we going to see different designs of airports? Is the focus going to be on speed? What will it be?
Different designs of airports. The problem you have with airports today is 75% of the passengers, all the air passengers in the United States, use 32 airports. So we have smaller airports like Daytona Beach, like Sanford. They have smaller numbers. The way they build their facilities, the airport structure themselves, is with passenger facility fees. On every ticket, they can charge up to $4.50. That rate was set 20-some years ago, but it's still $4.50. So that's how they build the structure. The airport runways, the lighting, everything you see outside, the air traffic control in the system, you pay a tax on your airplane ticket. And that percentage is calculated, and that's what builds the airport infrastructure outside of the terminal. With those 30 airports, the 32 airports, all of them are at their maximum as far as bonded indebtedness and the ability to enhance the facility. So they're financially strapped. It's just like roads were strapped because we have a fuel tax that was set up for the 50s and 60s. It's not for 2018. And the answer to infrastructure is first finance cash. You got to have the money to do the projects. And America does have a deficit, a very serious deficit in transportation and infrastructure and financing it.
What likely is going to happen in terms, we know there's a pilot shortage.
Yeah.
Embry-Riddle is
Yeah.
trying to fill that. We're now working with Delta. Other airlines are interested in us. We have all of these people going to be retiring. So we have air traffic controller shortage. We have pilot shortage.
You have a shortage in military pilots, too. We used to harvest many of our commercial pilots from the military. And now, actually, we're harvesting our best pilots from Embry-Riddle University. Everywhere I go around the country and around the world, almost everyone I run into has been a part of education, aviation education at Embry-Riddle. They're also straining because they've got a lot of demand of, I understand, of people wanting to train. So we can only get so many potatoes into a 10-pound sack. But we've got to look at alternatives, work with the people like Embry-Riddle that are producing the pilots. The solutions aren't in Washington or Washington coming up with a pilot training program. The solutions are out here with institutions like Embry-Riddle, and then partnering with them to make certain that you have the trained personnel. So it's going to take some time, and you don't train a pilot in a day or two, and then you have many hours in the cockpit before you qualify. We've even increased some of those requirements for our commuter airlines, which we did after 3 or 4 horrible crashes. We had Buffalo, we had Charlotte, we had Lexington, and some of the survivors helped champion the families. Help champion the cause. I work with in a bipartisan manner with the former late chairman, Oberstar. We passed the commuter safety bill, but we actually required more training, more hours, and other reforms that would make a difference. And actually, since we've passed that bill, there have been very few even commuter crashes. And if you stop and think, since after 9/11, we had an American airline flight go down in Long Island, and that's really the last large aircraft to have that kind of tragedy. Unfortunately, and I remarked when I see my former staffers in aviation that we are overdue, because you have a human system. It has great technology, but there's always that chance for error, and that we're overdue for something to happen there.
I'm going to come 2 questions on aviation, then I'm going to move to roads, and we can come back to aviation and aerospace through the questions from the audience. Why is it that the FAA holds its collective breath on reauthorization every time? What goes on?
Well, actually, it's tough. It's tough when you're changing that policy. You're looking at the guy that authored in 2002. I was chairman after, of course, after 9/11, and for 6 years. I did the reauthorization in 2002. That one lasted until 2012. And when I had to redo the one in 12, the Democrats had control before I became chairman, and they did 20-some extensions. It's just difficult to pass. We did pass it in 2012, and a few weeks ago, you saw President Trump just passed the first legislation since 2002 replacing the bills that I authored, which lasted pretty good. But my point is, it's hard. There's all kinds of competing interests, everybody tugging and pulling, and little changes make a big difference in that legislation. But the thing you have to also be aware of is technology changes. So right now we have an outmoded 1950s air traffic control system, and we're behind the curve there. It's unfortunately going to take another aviation disaster to propel changing that system out. We have a ground-based radar system. Canada and other nations have already gone to a space GPS system, much with redundancy. As you know, you have to have in any system. Chairman Schuster took proposal that I offered some years ago for changing this out, privatization, and took it a good distance. President Trump tried too, but that kind of dramatic change was not propelled in this environment. It will happen, mark this comment, but unfortunately it's going to probably be after a disaster.
Next-gen technology.
Yeah.
Do you think under this administration, Congress will end up either
Well, if they work with
pulling it back?
If they work with, well, no, you've got to do next gen.
But no, there's been a lot of talk about the funding.
I know, but you've got to do next generation air traffic control, getting the technology, and some of that is centered. Some of the research, the work, the verification of the systems working is happening right here at Embry-Riddle and in our area. But that has to move forward, you know. Newt Gingrich, when I came to Congress, used to run around with a little tube, and that was the technology we had for the most part. We didn't have some of the technology that we have today. Now, some has changed out, but technology changes dramatically in our in this age, and sometimes the legislation doesn't keep up with the technology. So it's hard sometimes to change that policy and get people's attention, and then go down the more productive path and the more technologically advanced path.
What about drone usage? We have a cooperative arrangement with our police.
I need one now to see what my roofer's been doing. You know,
are we going to see more?
I got to find a kid that's got one with a camera on it. Should be able to do that. Contact me at my. When Elaine Chow was here for the opening of the Student Center, she cited the number of licensed drone operators there are. Mm-hmm. It's phenomenal. And those are the licensed ones. It's not the licensed ones necessarily that'll get us in trouble. But we're here also in the age in a new technological age. Who would have thought that drones would be so prevalent, would be delivering goods and monitoring traffic and all the things that they do, agriculture, forest fires, yeah. So again, and we started at the federal level with looking at some demonstration projects, looking at trying to put together the new rules of the game. FAA's been a little reluctant, and they are a little reluctant to put into place new rules for new technology. Nobody wants to do something that isn't going to do the job, or doesn't turn out right, or doesn't resolve the problem. So they're bureaucrats, and they're trying to put in place the rules to operate. But there are many considerations, and to get it all right is not easy. So it's been a struggle to get to that next step for the governance and the proper use of drones, and then keeping us safe. But here again, mark this prediction, Mark, we'll have a drone incident that will propel changes and reform. It'll be in place. And then the way it'll happen is, federal government always does this, they overreact, they'll put things in that always don't work, then they'll have to go back and revise it 4 or 5 times.
Let's talk about autonomous vehicles. As it appears, there was a story NBC had, 230 or 250,000 trucker jobs will become stabilized and pushed to the side for autonomous vehicles. But today, a news story through the Wall Street Journal talks about having the driver in the vehicle but not driving the vehicle.
Well, that's true, and you can be in a remote location. It's just like the aerial vehicles. Someone's piloting it. The thing isn't operating on its own. And we've already had, with aviation, we've had cargo carriers leave, I think, from Australia to the mainland U.S. without pilots. We've had a host of new vehicles coming online. And it's coming on much faster than I would have even predicted that are driverless. But that's in the vehicle, but somewhere there is a human being propelling and guiding the vehicle. Will probably be to a stage where it will be have so many crash avoidance systems that it can go totally on its own, but it will still have to be directed humanly, and that's another another whole new area in the future.
You voted, and you were part of the vote on helping the auto industry when they were really hurt. And look now, GM is changing its business model.
No, I didn't vote for the bailouts.
You didn't vote for the bailouts?
Not for the bailouts, no.
No assistance?
I was not a bailout guy, kind of guy.
But the airline
No,
you bailed
but
out.
I did the airline, and again, when I structured it, we put the taxpayer and the taxpayer's interest up front. If anything had crashed, we took the assets. I didn't model it after previous government programs, but more of a business and banking finance approach. We put that first. We made it very tough. We got the money paid back. Now with GM, I was not a bailout kind of guy. I feel the private sector, you can help them, but you also can't go overboard. It's like we help the airlines in a time of national disaster, but if they don't have a business plan that works, and I feel very sorry for the 15,000 that they just laid off, but those are business decisions. If the bottom line doesn't work, and government should not be there to subsidize that operation. That's just my feeling.
Let's talk about ports. I saw you give a speech on the House floor once about your concerns about security at ports.
Well,
with all of the different cargo pieces.
That's a tough one. We're spending a lot of money trying to protect them. We've secured the ports. We have not secured the people entering the ports properly. We have port IDs that have been just a total fiasco. They still aren't right. The IDs that are issued, they have to use a driver's license to confirm even who the driver is. Spent $1 billion on that program. That's part of what I wasn't happy. I'll tell you though, very important to Daytona Beach is the success of our port here and the former Cape Canaveral and Cape Kennedy complex. We have 77,000 acres there. As you know, I was hot when I became chairman of transportation. We also oversee public buildings and infrastructure. And I took the committee to the Port Canaveral. We identified at that hearing over 350 buildings on the property, 77,000 acres. That's, I think you could get a couple Manhattans into that. But in any event, about 2/3 of the buildings were vacant. Even if we had given the buildings up to the private sector to come and use, and stop an empty federal building has a lot of expense to it. Security, in most instances, air conditioning and maintenance. You still have to maintain an empty building. Spending millions on that. From that hearing, we encouraged bringing in the private sector, and you've seen what's happened. That's now turned into a center of manufacturing. We used to just bring the space vehicles in there and the components and just put the big pieces together. Now they're manufacturing there. There are thousands of new jobs. They've taken some of that. We took some of the buildings down, which were cheaper to take down, sell the metal and other things and get income rather than pay millions to keep them empty and air condition them. That, to me, is a great story of success. And the port there is a further success story, and it's key to this area, too, because you have increased cargo, you have increased dramatic increased cruise. It's one of the biggest cruise ports now in the United States, if not the world. That is a great story. And I'll tell you who also was the port nut, that I should say advocate. He wasn't a nut, but it was Governor Scott. And some of the deals I cut with Governor Scott to support some of the projects I wanted was to support the enhancement of the ports. And Governor Scott any governor of Florida now, DeSantis, has a challenge because we have about a dozen ports, and they have to compete, which they should on their own, but they also have competition from Savannah, Georgia, one port. You go up to Virginia, Norfolk, one port. You go up to New York City, one port. And so they can be they can have much greater support from the state, and sometimes that happens. But Florida and with the governor's leadership did some great things. We did a trade-off with Sunrail when we bought CXX tracks from Volusia down to Osceola County, and we transferred the freight traffic to the center line of CSX in the center of the state and created the biggest intermodal center in Florida, the biggest in the United States. And I was just told in the last week, the success of that intermodal by bringing the straight through the less populated area gets it there faster, better. It's a huge success, and they're actually building an addition to what Governor Scott and I broke ground for already. Again, it's so smart the way they chose centering it in the state, coming out to the ports east and west, going north and south. So there's some neat stories. You haven't asked me about transportation for Volusia County, and I've got some exciting news there.
Yeah, let's talk about what you shared with the Speedway today, and I'm going to come back and go into the Sunrail thing with you. What's happening?
Well, Sunrail is progressing. Volusia was not at the station when the train left.
I rode it from DeBary, but it's not coming to DeLand.
Well, again, when we started this out, I had a different plan. I was going to do a smaller project with demo. That's another long story. But they decided to have a 4-county effort. In order to get Volusia County into the mix, we needed a stop, at least one stop in Volusia County. And even though the ridership from downtown and Sand Lake to Volusia was not as good as the south, believe it or not, from Point Siena and Kissimmee, the ridership studies showed better traffic. We needed to get a first leg done. And I was in the right position to force doing it, and to get Volusia in, we did the DeBary stop. In the second phase, which was from the area again at Sand Lake all the way down through Osceola, very, very good ridership numbers. They were so good that in the second phase we had planned to do from DeBary to DeLand. The new chairman came in. I called, I wrote, I begged, I pleaded. You've got to make a decision by a certain date to be on board and be in this second phase. Volusia missed the train coming out of the station. It's Volusia's fault, period. And I'm not in office. I don't have to please anybody. I'll tell you what the hell happened. That's what happened.
Who was in charge on this?
Well, on that one, you had a new chairman and a new commission, so they didn't do what they needed to do in time. So they went ahead with phase 2. Phase 2 was just completed. So you now have it from DeBary. You can go all the way into Osceola County. That's all done. The remaining piece to get to the airport in Orlando has now been picked up by Brightline, which just partnered, and it's a story that people don't realize the significance of it, but Brightline just partnered with Virgin Rail. And I've worked with Richard Branson and his company. I watched Virgin Rail, which is running in England and took over routes there that were formerly public money losers, dogs, and he turned them from taking taxpayer money into paying the government money and successful, profitable operations. So Brightline is coming. It's got a partner with it that's phenomenal. Brightline they just broke ground coming from Cocoa area. FEC, you know, is the Brightline line. It goes from Miami to Jacksonville. They don't come into Orlando Airport, but when they built the B line way back in the space, beginning of the space era, along the B line 4-lane highway, which was built mostly to get to the Space Coast, they put a rail embankment. It was never built. So there was always a plan for rail there. But they have to come in from Cocoa, that area, and then come into the Orlando Airport. The Orlando Airport station for Brightline is done. It's completed. It's in the new intermodal center, which will house 4 different modes of fixed transit. That could be light rail, it could be commuter rail, it could be high-speed rail, any of the above. But that new intermodal center was $1.4 billion. $200 million was state money, and $1.2 billion was from user fees. You pay $450. Remember, I told you passenger facility fees. Well, that's what pays for that. But go see it. It's a phenomenal infrastructure that's done. It's also the gateway to the second terminal in Orlando, and they're building that now. That's $2-3 billion, which will be right. That's how you'll get back and forth from the north old terminal to the new one. And then also all the train lines come in there. The train line for Brightline will go through that station on to Tampa. And I think they just cut a deal with Disney, was announced.
Due respect, though, you're getting further. We're getting further away. Does anything come our way?
No. Now that's the next part. Now this will happen in the next 2-3 years. Right beyond that, FEC and that line already comes through your community. It's a no-brainer to have a station here. Daytona absolutely will have a station. And the local leaders need to get their act together. I spoke to the NASCAR people today. That's going to be a huge impact for Embry-Riddle, for Daytona State, for the racetrack, for NASCAR. I mean, and you'll be able to have some fixed transportation off of that line. Initially, it can be done with buses or trams or whatever they want to do, but eventually you'll probably have a fixed system servicing these facilities. You have thousands of students here, thousands of students across the street. You have hundreds of thousands that come to NASCAR and Daytona Raceway events. So that's coming. Again, they're finishing the fight along the Treasure Coast of who gets the stops and where it's going to be. And they'll probably have 2 types of service. One would be with different stops along the way, and there'll be some direct service too. And I think you'll see some development that's unbelievable along the way. We have $2 billion worth of development along the Sunrail line. Yeah. $2 billion.
Charles Lichterman was in on that down in DeBerry. It's really nice.
Well, I didn't know about DeBerry, but I can tell you, go to Maitland, there's 1,900 mayor. I just saw Dale, mayor of Maitland, 1,900 new units along that little corridor. It just goes on and on. What happens. And DeBerry's been one of the most successful.
I've taken that train. It's great. And it frustrates me that it gets out of DeBerry.
Well, the other thing, too, is it's not people take mass transit if it's convenient and it meets their schedule. And it doesn't do that all now. But when they get the connection into OIA, you will see probably not 24/7, but maybe 18/7, 18 hours a day, 7 days a week, train service, and that's what you need, is because some people are on different shifts, et cetera. So, and then connecting into the bus systems like Votran. Votran, which has a private, it's a private operator, was most cooperative and has, we have the little intermodal center in DeLand, but that serves the community right now as well as you can at what you can afford now.
Having been to Europe as many times as you've seen traffic circles. They're popping up more often in the United States. There's talk about doing at least one or two here.
I'm not a traffic engineer, but
what do you think?
If it works, use it, you know.
Okay.
I'm more excited about, I gave my daughter my cell phone, so I can't pull it out of my pocket. But the technology we have now, and we're going to see one of the first deployments. It will be in Orlando. Your cell phone emits little electronic signals, and they have equipment now that can detect them when not listening to your program or your conversation. Although we do that with the CIA, as you know. But in any event. Those signals can be picked up by equipment, and I've seen it demonstrated that the equipment picks up the signals from the vehicles where the cell phones are and can tell the speed, the number of vehicles going through, and calculate, just like you do your routes and all on your cell phone now with Waze and map and all of that. But that can be used to change out your signalization. I think they're doing 4 corridors in Orlando, 4 of the most congested corridors. I think Highway 50, and Elaine Chao, who was here a few weeks ago, actually it didn't get funded under the past administration. The proposal was passed up when I was there, but I have to thank the secretary, because in a new round of funding, they gave the funds to demonstrate this technology. But it revolutionizes the way traffic flows, because it can pick it up in real time. Unfortunately, most of what you have out here in these streets is sold by vendors, and everyone says they've got the best thing since sliced bread. Some of them have instruments below the pavement, which are expensive to install, that detect your car. Some have a little camera or a reader, and that changes out the lights sometimes. And and if you've seen the big box next to the intersection, that's like a big mechanical Swiss clock that they collect data and figure out, well, on Monday it needs to be from 9 to 12, go at this thing, and then changes it out. Those are all like middle-age, medieval equipment compared to what is on we're on the verge of instituting. So that's one that's coming. One of the first demos will be 4 or 5 major arteries in Orlando, but then other communities like this will pick them up, and it's very inexpensive to change out compared to some of the other systems. One of the other things that I did, and it's not quite done, Pat actually, I said, we've got a leased vehicle, and I said, we need a sun pass for it. So she got it, and she just read that it's good in the entire East Coast except for St. Augustine, South Carolina. And so I'm going to raise hell with South Carolina, but I put a provision in the MAP 21 bill that all electronic passes would be interoperable by a certain date. That date passed just as I was leaving Congress, and I gave them a pass at that time because they had some advanced technology through cell phones that could also, you could also use your cell phone for a pass anywhere in the country. And there was a court case pending, so I gave them a pass. But there is no reason in the world why you shouldn't be able to take your electronic pass from here to Seattle to Maine and use it. And mark this one too, Mark. Now that I found out South Carolina's gone south on us, I'll get that changed.
True or false? I have a source that
You don't like that idea? You like that idea? Okay, good.
I
had one applause. Hang him.
I have a source that told me
Yeah.
the president spoke with you about being transportation secretary. True or false?
No, he did not.
Come on.
He did not speak to me about it. But his advisors, some of his advisors, and I did have some eyes and ears in the room at the selection.
Thank you.
And my biggest advocate was Ivanka Trump, and I worked with her on the post office hotel project. And I know for a fact who my advocates were. But I think they made a very wise choice. They needed a woman, and a qualified woman. I wasn't willing to go through the operation. And actually, I've known Elaine, and I've worked with her since. It's very pleased. I was not pleased the first 2 years with his transportation advisors in the White House, and that's why I didn't. They couldn't accept what you had to do to put an infrastructure plan together. And now I know the president's considering, and I've heard as much as $1 trillion, which is going to be, I could put together a package for $500 billion, but when you get to $1 trillion, it's stretching it. Possibly could be done, but they also missed the boat on the tax bill, which should have had incentives for the private sector that could put money in. The I-4 project is half private money, and that is, if you can't get all public money or raise taxes, you've got to find some other means of putting cash into the project. And unfortunately, they missed the boat. In fact, they backslid some on both P3s, which is private sector partnership projects, and also on private activity bonds, which give you a break on interest when you go out privately and borrow money. And Brightline has used some of those, and people say, oh, it's a giveaway. That's not a giveaway. Private activity bonds, the bondholder takes the risk, not the taxpayer. The bondholder loses the money if the project goes south. It's not the government. The government gives us an incentive for people to invest in it, a reduction or diminution of the taxes on the income from the bonds. So that's the way it works. But the main thing is you're getting cash in. This is the biggest question right now, and it's going to be, you've got new, more liberal people in the House, and Peter DeFazio will be the chairman. It's a good friend. On the Republican side will be Sam Graves, one of my lieutenants. But they've got to come up with a way to, there's not going to be any infrastructure plan for this country unless you have the cash or the money to finance it. It's that simple. So if you can't raise it in the private sector, and they've missed the boat there with private money coming into the projects, giving them some incentive, they may be looking at trying to increase the gas tax. The word I've gotten back is it's a non-starter in the Senate. Trump has courted it. And of course, one of the biggest advocates of increasing the gas tax was Tom Donahoe, who makes $5 million as the CEO of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. He used to come to my committee and, he did come to my committee and advocate the gas tax increase, after which I sent out a press release that I thought he ought to look for other employment. But he's still there. He'll probably be back. You can make some arguments, and there are ways to increase the gas tax, but it doesn't solve your problem, folks, because people are getting off gas. We have 1 million cars a year going or more going on to alternative fuels. go up to the Capitol building, and I'll take you in one of the office buildings, and you can see members of Congress who are hip and with it for their constituents with electronic, no smog vehicles or fog, whatever, pollution vehicles, and they're plugging their car into the socket there, and you're paying not only their salary, but you're paying their fuel costs too. So you've got to find a way to finance the system that's fair and equitable.
We want to have some students get some questions in the time that we have left with the Congressman or the general public. Come right up to the microphone. You can ask your question. Please, no speeches. Just come up and ask your question. While we wait, quick question. I saw Vicente Fox on television today, and I was reminded of when you met with him.
Oh, God.
And yeah, that was the reaction you gave me years ago. He's still talking, and he's not in power.
Well,
and they have a new president who just got sworn in.
Most of those people should be in jail along with the drug traffickers, right up to the president's office. Now, I have had no briefings on the current president, but I can tell you in the past that right to the president's office, to the street, they were as corrupt as vile and got sucked into the drug trade. And Trump is looking at this and speaking about it for the first time. The last 8 years, I don't even know if they had a hearing. Let me tell you how bad it's gotten. When I was chairman, go back and look from 98 to 2000, I was chairman of Criminal Justice Drug Policy Committee, and there were something like 20,000 drug overdose deaths in the country, and that was bad. Last year, the latest statistics just came out. Over 70,000 people died from drug overdose in the United States. And it wasn't some doctor prescribing. That's a bull story that they try to feed you, that doctors are over-prescribing. There was some over-prescription, but I'm telling you, that's not the issue. And even now, the policy we putting more restrictions on the doctor. My doctor told me that when people are in pain, you'll go get anything. And they're going to get anything, and they're getting heroin and drugs, other drugs off the illegal market to deal with their pain. Do you know more kids in high school smoke marijuana than cigarettes? Do you know that that drug driving now exceeds drunken driving? It used to be so many people died from driving drunk. Now it's drug driving. We don't even have the mechanism yet to test the people who are on drugs. In Europe they do, and I had a couple displayed. But this has gotten totally out of hand. We've lost 250,000 people in the last 4 or 5 years to drug overdose. You look at almost all the violence and crime, it's drug related. It's totally out of control. I know the president has done some things. I don't know if the wall will stop it, but this stuff is coming in from Mexico predominantly. A lot of it's coming from China through Mexico and through our porous borders. Some is coming even through the U.S. mail. But this is a societal problem. The numbers, just think of it. It's like wiping out the entire Daytona Beach area in a year with drug overdose deaths. And again, the impact on transportation. Now they're doing more. I think they've just gotten back the results of some studies on pilots, for example. Alcohol, which used to be a problem, is now down in the lower percentile, but coming to work as a pilot or in an aviation capacity, mechanic or whatever, and you're stoned, is a new set of very serious issues for our country.
Want to take a question? Anyone want to please come up to the microphone so we can take your question? And you're first tonight for Congressman John Mica. Your name and your year of study.
My name is Inky. I'm a sophomore student here at Embry-Riddle. I'm a major in aerospace engineering. I want to ask Mr. Congressman, do you think U.S. would develop a major high-speed train network like China did to reduce the pressure of other transportation?
Well, the reason that the United States does not have a true high-speed train system is because of Amtrak. Amtrak is our Soviet-style U.S. train system. And they basically have the monopoly and franchise for all passenger interstate service. As chairman, I tried to change some of that, getting some competition, and Amtrak does everything they can to kill it. The only place where they've succeeded in providing more, it's not high speed, but more train service, passenger train service, is what is called state-sponsored routes. And what I put in the last transportation rail bill was incentives for the projects that would be supported not just by the federal government, but by the state government and other partners. So you had to have people who are willing to put their money where their mouth was for the systems. Those have increased some, but those are not real Amtrak projects. Amtrak runs on 22,000 miles of track in the United States. It serves about 46 states. I think there are 4 without them. But Amtrak does not own the trackage. The tracks, all but about 600 or 700 miles are owned by freights, so the freights maintain them. But Amtrak is their own worst enemy. Now they're looking at restarting some real money-losing routes. We subsidized them, I think last year was $1.4 billion. They lost in 12 years, Amtrak has lost $1 billion in food service. It's selling food on their trains. Yeah. They've lost $1 billion. I held a hearing on this, in a number of hearings. We've actually put provisions which they've ignored that they couldn't operate at a loss. You have a captive audience on a train, and you're losing $1 billion. It's remarkable. But I actually held a press conference to illustrate how bad it was in front of a McDonald's in downtown Washington. I had one of the biggest press turnouts ever, and I held up a hamburger and a Coke. And the Coke, if you buy on Amtrak, it's subsidized something like $3 a drink. Every time somebody buys a drink on Amtrak, it costs the taxpayers $3. And then the hamburger was $6 loss or something like that. It was phenomenal.
It was a chicken salad.
That got a lot of attention. But there needs to be private folks, and that's why Virgin Rail, which they are true high speed, is an average speed of about 110 to 120 miles per hour. That's the average speed. Amtrak from Washington to New York goes 68 miles an hour. Okay? 68 miles. That's not high speed. From New York to Boston, it's like 56 miles an hour.
Whoa.
But they won't give up the franchise to operate. They do make some money in the Northeast Corridor because they're a monopoly. Even in Europe now, the European Union passed a law for the European Union countries that they must allow competition. I wrote in Italy, they have the private rail and they have the government rail. In Slovakia, I went and they have the private rail and the government rail. And it's funny, some of the students I met in Slovakia, the new private rail in Slovakia from Bratislava, the capital, out had the private rail, beautiful new trains, really nice. And then the government trains, and I was with one of my former interns who lives in Slovakia, and I said, the students aren't getting on because the government was actually offering cheaper fares than the private one. And I said, the kids aren't getting on the cheaper one. He said, no, they like the clean, modern private one. But with Virgin Rail, they do higher speed. They did the lines from London to Glasgow, London to Edinburgh. They were losing a couple £100 million a year. Now they're paying the federal government instead of losing it. And they invested billions, and the ridership has soared through the roof. So at some point, somebody in Washington who are sleeping on their you-know-what, or sitting, I guess they're sitting and sleeping, will wake up and say, we should be doing that. Now, China is using all our money to build incredible systems. The big thing you have with China now is, in talking to Siemens and to Bombardier and to all of the different international folks who are producing rail equipment, is the Chinese have set up their own town that does nothing but produce train vehicles. In fact, the Chinese just won, I think, Boston to replace their cars. So now it's biting the Europeans, and of course we don't produce too many. There is some production that's required in the United States. So, but China has it's not, Chinese is not all private. I must say it's government, but they do a pretty good job on it. Some of the most successful ones are in Europe. I went to a high-speed rail conference, and the guy sitting next to me was Sergei Yankovic or something. And I said, what are you doing here? He says, oh, I represent the line from Leningrad, from St. Petersburg to Moscow. And that's a public-private partnership. So they have high-speed private rail in Russia from the capital to St. Petersburg. And we have Amtrak Soviet-style trains from Boston to Washington.
We're going to take another question on this side.
Good question.
Thank you.
First off, good evening. My name is Mitchell Kim. I'm a sophomore here at Embry-Riddle, and I study aeronautical science. And I was wondering what your thoughts are pertaining to the single pilot cargo operations and how it's going to affect the airline industry and the aviation industry as a whole.
Did he say pilot?
Single pilot cargo operations.
Single pilot cargo operations.
Well, pretty soon there won't be a pilot in that plane, so. Well, again, you have, I've seen this debate of how many engineers you should have on a train, how many pilots you should have in a plane, blah, blah, blah. Technology does change things. There, decisions are made both for safety and also for economy and then keeping up with technology. So it's always that balance. Yeah, but I told some folks earlier, they've already done pilotless cargo aircraft from Australia to the West Coast, I know. And that's, again, it's a different technology, and there's always, as I said, still a human factor where maybe our kids will see it when the thing is thinking about doing it by itself. Haven't quite gotten there.
I know there are some people in the audience that are wondering, in your opinion, are we coming to the end of contrition among the airlines? Will the Federal Trade Commission or the FAA say, wait a minute, there's no competition, I mean, we're getting fewer and fewer? Your thoughts?
Well, there's a huge consolidation, and I had mixed feelings. First, I felt it wasn't that good. I talked to some of the experts. They say it was inevitable. I don't think it would be healthy beyond where we are, but it does foster competition. some Frontier. You've got Allegiant out of Central Florida is one of the most successful, picking up niches. I understand Daytona may get, Silver Air
Yeah.
to do some service.
Here it's a Lauderdale.
Yeah, and then now I just read where there's there's always somebody doing something new and different. Uber. 10 years ago, if you said Uber, they thought you were, had some sort of a defect. But now it's not. There are different firms already, or where you can call up a plane, and people are picking you up just like Uber and transporting you. So times change, and people are very clever in what they do.
Over here, your question for Congressman Mica.
Hi, my name is Owen Thiek.
Come up closer
Yeah,
to
a
the
little
mic.
closer to the microphone, please.
My name is Owen Thiek, and I'm studying Aviation Business Administration here at Embry-Riddle. Speaking about the consolidation amongst airlines, right now oil costs are rising, and you've witnessed several mergers and acquisitions and bankruptcies through your years as a congressman. Do you think there's a possibility for the federal government to bail out another airline?
Absolutely not. I wouldn't bail them out. The only when we had, how old are you?
19.
Okay. Well, about the time right after you were born there, we had 9/11. It almost destroyed American aviation because no one would finance aviation enterprise. So that was something we put in place, but it was temporary. We had guarantees with those kinds of things. But I don't know. I think you have to foster an environment that encourages people to invest, and you can give them some breaks. The Essential Air Service Program is another government program that blew out of control. It was started as a subsidy to pay smaller airports for service where they couldn't get service towards the cost of bringing service in. I think it started at 40 or 50 million. It was up to $250 million, and we tried to reduce it. But only in very rare instances would I look at that subsidization. They should be able to do it on their own or minimal. When the British privatized their rail, they took in, since most of those were losing proposition, they took in the least amount of subsidization, won the contract. And then those who could turn it around, of course, were rewarded the contract. And that's how Virgin Rail got into the business of rail. And of course, they were very successful in aviation. You see some discount airlines. My wife and I booked a $179 ticket to Europe on one of our trips this year. $179 from Washington to England. And I think we had to pay about $30 for a bag. I'll tell you a cute story about it, though. My wife says, "You sure you want to take this? This is a chance." I said, "Well, it looks okay." So we took it, and we only took it one way. We came back another line. In about a month or two after we were back, it was called Premier Air. They went under. So,
kidding.
and they say if you have a large amount of money and you want to invest, and lose it, put it into an airline, startup airline.
We've got an opportunity for a couple of questions before we finish. If you would come right up to the microphone and ask your question. Thank you. Good evening. Right close to the mic. Go ahead.
Here? Right.
Yep.
Hi, Congressman. I'm Gerard Sullivan. I'm a freshman here at Embry-Riddle. I'm studying aviation business, and I was wondering what current federal government regulations keep a new airline from starting up?
What current air regulations prevent a new company from starting up?
Well, there are a lot of regulations and put in for the protection of the flying public, for safety, a whole host of part whatever, what's the number, part whatever you got to do, requirements. I think they try to be as reasonable as possible, but you also, the responsibility of an elected federal official is to protect the public, okay? So from a safety, from and security of their flying, you can't have untrained personnel, and you can't have equipment that isn't airworthy. So those are things you have to balance out, and but there obviously aren't too many. I mean, so many disincentives because there are a lot of startup operations. Unfortunately, it requires a lot of money and a lot of backing, and then some endurance. The big ones have consolidated. They're not all my favorite characters. I think the pendulum for the consumer, I think the consumer gets shafted quite a bit by the big airlines. I had actually started drafting a consumer protection bill. There's a whole host of areas where the public interest is, again, abandoned by some of the biggest carriers. I wouldn't like to hear me say that, but it's always sort of one-sided, and then if for the airline, like tomorrow I'll eat a ticket, and I deserve to eat a ticket. I need to be in Washington earlier for the departure ceremony from the Capitol, but I had a 11-hour delay a few weeks ago, and I got a $100 coupon, I guess. Well, they said 100, but I got 50, and I didn't think that was fair. And it was their fault. I mean, if it's weather, that's one thing. I was on 3 different planes, ended up in Savannah, and finally got to my destination at 3 o'clock in the morning. Started out at 12 noon. But again, I think there needs to be more equity towards the consumer.
Time for one more question.
So far away.
Pull it right toward you if you want.
Okay. I'm short.
There we go.
So my name's Tia. I'm actually a PhD student from UCF. I'm a graduate from here. So something that we do need to consider, we may not see it commercially, but we're seeing it right now with ambulances, is flying vehicles, so flying cars. There are a lot of deaths that happen with ambulances in traffic. While they're in transit to the hospital, there are a lot of deaths that are caused because of that delay. Is there any talk right now with policy regarding flying vehicles?
Well, this is on flying ambulances and
commercial cars.
Yeah.
They're
Well, we've done some studies on this, and it's a tough one to regulate. A lot of your emergency air vehicles, too, are run by municipalities and government entities, and then you have some by hospitals and private entities, sorting it all out, and we've had a lot of accidents, unfortunately. But again, getting the right regulations in place and making certain that the operators are safe. But many of those, there's some good reports you can read about some of the issues there. A lot of them operate in very difficult conditions, sometimes weather, sometimes hazardous situation where there's been an accident or tragedy. And again, writing the law and the rules to fit every situation is sometimes a challenge, and having it keep up with the technology that we have out there is also a challenge. So it's sort of a constant ebb and flow. And then you heard how long it takes to pass these changes in statute. So certain things get left behind. And then from a standpoint of seeing it, there are a lot of competing interests in Washington, and it's not all just paid lobbyists. It's people who have some skin in the game or something at stake, and they see it from their perspective and try to relay it to a member of Congress or their staff who aren't experts in it. So sometimes things don't get done that should get done. Sometimes, again, they overreact.
Want to thank the staff that's worked with us today, our students who worked with us this fall season, to Daryl Labello, who's caught so much of our video this fall as well with Bob Score, and to Tony Petro, who makes sure that all the lights are on and all the microphones are working. Dr. Butler, thank you for being here. Mrs. Butler, we appreciate it. Dr. Butler, you being here as well. And our season closes, but we'll restart February 4th. Dr. Butler has invited Dr. Ellen Stoffen from the Space Museum in Washington to be a special guest. There'll be activities on campus that day, and then she will appear in the Embry-Riddle Speaker Series. Also, we'll be featuring the book Spacecraft, all about rockets and spacecraft later in the spring. Will also be part of the Embry-Riddle Speaker Series. Thank you for your support and for your patronage and being with us this fall. We resume right after the holidays. We wish you a very, very pleasant holiday season. Once again, a warm reception for Congressman John Mica. Thank you so much. Thank you all. Happy holidays.